For as long as I could remember, I've always enjoyed being afraid. And why shouldn't I? There's nothing like feeling the pulse-pounding adrenaline of being in near danger only to escape just barely. Simulated fear is something I have grown attached to, and if you watched my prior video, you'd know that. If I were to give my opinion on horror video games, I'd say when they are bad, they are horrible. When they are okay, they are forgettable. When they are good, they are just passable. But when they are great, they are considered some of the greatest pieces of media to have ever existed. I don't think it's a coincidence that the majority of the best examples of what most people would consider games as art incorporate different themes of horror. BioShock, Silent Hill 2, The Last of Us. These are, albeit cherry-picked, fantastic games. And great stories, too. But, as it stands, the game I'm about to talk about, in my honest opinion, is probably in the same league as them. I'll come back to it a bit later, but let's skip ahead to the game itself. You're on a lonely train ride. Your character, drifting in and out of sleep, but the thing that keeps them awake is them thinking about their lives. Our character, Marco, a burly man, wide-set, physically imposing, sits there and thinks about his life woven with tragedy. His sister, married to a gang member in what is the world's version of 1930s Italy, he was a boxer and forced to do some things he wished he hadn't. It led to him having to flee to a new country, hopefully where he can start over. But the guilt does follow him. He dozes off and wakes up sometime later. The train cart is empty and you look around, eventually following the light of a blue butterfly to some room. You walk in and are immediately accosted by some individual out of a nightmare. Blue face paint and exposed genitals make him immediately uncomfortable to look at, but the fact he is going to attack you at the slightest provocation is the most important problem right now. Which will happen. You flail your arms and you swing at him, but there is no use. You will lose as he is armed with a weapon and you are not. Deciding to force you to work, he then cuts your legs off and forces you back to work. What were you supposed to be doing? You don't know. He only demands you keep making the wooden cubes that are scattered about the room. Eventually he leaves you alone long enough to look around, crawling on your arms as the stumps of your legs are almost completely obliterated. The pain now almost numb from the blood loss and shock, you eventually see some woman wandering around and you follow her, only to be teleported to an even more confusing place. Godlike giants sit and stare at you from massive tables, almost in a quaint familial setting, before you are teleported once more to a new location where you meet him. An envoy to the moon god, discussing that there is a festival happening and there are 14 new contestants that need to include themselves, you of which is included in that 14. He sends you off and you wake up for real this time, look at the world around you and you notice the train has stopped, but you are still in the forest. Upon exiting the train, you find about a dozen other folk who are just as confused as you. They all introduce themselves and thus you meet each and every other person. The oddity here is after a head count, plus including the one or two individuals who left in a hurry, there are 14 of you, and worse still, every other person here had the same dream as you. Debates of if it was a mass hallucination event or an experiment gone wrong occur, though since nothing is happening, a few folk decide to stay on the train and a few folk decide to leave and go into the woods to the nearby village to seek help. The scene fades out and you simply see day one. From here, you are greeted with some of the most horrifying imagery that can be put into a single game, let alone an RPG Maker horror game. Brute force violence of all kinds, and god fucking damn it, it is amazing. Now is the time for funny. The jokes are gonna happen now. This game kicks so much fucking ass. Fear and Hunger is a beautiful and masterful game. I will grant them that. It is a game that moves the needle of horror and horror storytelling, but not to be exaggerated in the slightest, but Fear and Hunger 2 is not only a better game in almost every regard than the first one, it is probably one of the best horror games I have ever played in my entire life. I adore this game so much that I made the Fear and Hunger 1 video just so I could talk about this game. I love the sound design, I love the characters, the enemy designs, fantastic. The references, don't worry, we'll get there. I'm gonna try to go through this with as little spoilers as humanly possible and cover more or less only the early sections and maybe the midpoint sections of the game, so I can convince every last one of you to play the game if you haven't already. So let's break this down a bit more, and like I said earlier, let's go back and cover a bit more of what we missed, or rather what I didn't go over. I'm going to only be covering the earlier parts of the game, which is good, and cover from my own perspectives how I view the game and why I think it's immediately better than traditional Fear and Hunger. So for one, you boot up the game and, oh hi Marina, then hit new game, and immediately you are hit with the first major difference. There is double the amount of characters available to play in this game than there is in the first one, which you might think means that they are kind of watered down in the process and have less to them, but you'd actually be completely wrong. Each character has quite the shtick to them. They are actually able to differentiate most of the characters because of a few new added features to the game that make them a little bit more interesting, and we'll get into what I mean in a second. Now, one of the features that I think is interesting that they added is there are now firearms, because this takes place somewhere between like 1920s and 1940s Europe. So there is obviously going to be old Enfield-style rifles, Mosin Nagant, if you will. Now, another one of these features is occultism. Occultism is fun. There were a few similar ideas in the original game, but suffice to say there's going to be ritual circles throughout the entirety of the game in certain areas that you can carve the symbols of old gods, new gods, and ascended gods in order to promote certain effects. There's actually quite a complex system to it where you have to identify which symbol belongs to which god and which of these circles is dedicated to that category of god, divided into new gods, old gods, and ascended ones, and then find out which symbol you're carving into it. There is only one character that starts with that at base, but let's wait a second to describe who they are. The next major difference is that each of these characters isn't identified by their title. They are actually identified by their name, which is a bit of a departure from the first game where when you were selecting your character, they were defined as mercenary, dark priest, outlander, and knight. It left it a bit of an impersonal tale because it was supposed to imply that this was a fairy tale, a story that you were reading from some ancient tome, or that this was just some kind of rumor that you heard and never knew the name of the character. But no, this game actually heavily personalizes each individual character and their story inside the gameplay itself. I think that that is a very good decision, as a lot of these characters have a lot of personality, and you're going to be interacting with them a lot more than you would interact with the other cast members in Hunger 1. So let's break down each of these characters so that you can kind of understand a little bit of their gimmicks, their personalities, and so on, and so you can make a more informed choice when you actually play the game, because you are going to play this game, right? Not just going to watch a lore video about a game you've never played and then just sit back and kind of think you know the game well enough. No one would do that, right? Right? Front and center, Levi. Ex-child soldier, very depressed. Benefits, starts with a gun, which, if you are playing the game, you'll realize having a gun is a good thing if it's you, and having a gun is a bad thing if it's someone else. A very bad thing, actually. Negative, he has a crippling heroin addiction. Yeah, this game is pretty dark, so I would say that it's like a lot darker than the first one, but let's not get too caught in the weeds here. Second, Marina. Love her. Love her carefree lifestyle. She is the occultist, like I was mentioned before, which is kind of an odd system where alongside carving symbols to gain basic effects on summoning symbols that you have in the game, you can also carve symbols into the faces of your party members to give them buffs if you understand what each of the symbols mean and what they do. Outside of that, she doesn't really have many offensive options, which is the main negative of her as the occultist. She's more of a support and buff character who goes down pretty quickly, and also has a messed up story. Oh god. Third, Dane, cool cat doctor who has medical examination style abilities that allow him to harvest organs for your own uses. He also can use medical shit better, which allows him to, support the party a little bit better. As for negatives, Jesus Christ! Abella is the fourth character, and she is just kind of good all around, but I never pick her as she is one of the first people you can actually recruit in the game pretty quickly without much effort, as long as you can get past those goddamn dogs and don't care too much about Henrik surviving. Canonically, has a fat ass. And also throws a wrench at Mach 9. Not many negatives with a lot of positives. Osa, based. Osa is an interesting character. I don't want to spoil it, but his intro scene where he relives his backstory is unironically one of the most interesting ideas I've ever seen thrown at a sequel to a game. So I don't want to spoil it. I'd say just get the game to play through an Osa game, and once it hits you what you're actually doing when you go through his intro and start making your choices, you're gonna smile. Oh, and also, oh my god, Nashra! Hi, how are you? Oh wow, you are looking rough. Buddy, you doing okay? Oh yeah, that. So yeah, Osa starts with the best gear. Starts with magic that can damage things pretty easily. Starts with a new god in his pocket, but you can die in your intro scene, which is neat, I guess. Olivia is the fifth character. You might think at a first glance she's probably going to be the worst character you can have, but no, actually, you'd be genuinely surprised how competent and good she is as a character. In a game entirely about removing limbs and how that's a detriment, if you lose your legs with any other character, your run's kind of done, but with Olivia, she doesn't really use her legs anyway, so it doesn't change the gameplay whatsoever. You can just lose your legs and it's not even a negative, so it's a wasted attack on the end of someone else. So I think that's actually like a really big benefit if you think about it in kind of a grim way. She also, canonically, is the only character that when they first get a gun and equip it, they don't freak out or think about how dangerous it is to have one of these. She says something akin to, "This is nice." Also, that wheelchair tech will save your life. Slow upstairs, fast downstairs. Eat my shit, Needles. Also, she can identify plants, and because of that, it gives you more options for healing and curative stuff later in the game. Then you have my favorite character, Jotaro Kujo, and yes, this is the 30th time that joke has been made. Marco is kind of broken due to his simplicity, but it's okay. I love him, and we'll get more into what I mean about him being kind of broken for the early game a little bit later, because he's going to be the character we use to give examples as to how the game progresses. So follow me if you will. Then we have Karen. I never pick Karen. She's like Levi without the heroin addiction and carries a weaker gun. I just never found her that interesting. She's a journalist who is here to investigate the Bremen War that is going on near Prehevil, the town that the game takes place in, and that's really all I care to know about her. She's kind of an okay character, kind of bland, a little bit cocksure of herself, but gets her into bad situations, as it were. It's always good to have a starting character that has a gun, so there is that. But regardless, I'm gonna pick Marco. Just so we can rep the boy, How old is JoJo Part 3 at this point? God, I'm getting old. So there is one more point that I think is in the favor of Termina, and it's, as you noticed, these aren't roles. These characters actually have names. So them having names is a very significant part of Funger 2. But another part of it is it also highlights the personal narrative of the story, which I think is the most important part. As I mentioned earlier, you are going to be interacting with the various characters that are on this train quite a lot, and you can miss so many of the different interactions you have, as there are 14 different characters that you have the ability to interact with, which allows you to kind of learn new snippets every time you play the game. There's this one character in the game, Tanaka, who is just the most unlucky man to ever exist. He will die if you so much as sneeze in the wrong direction, but if you keep him alive, there's a lot of random shit that can go down, and I think that's very interesting. But another thing thing that's kind of a benefit to Fear and Hunger is that you're always going to get the key feature skills of the characters that you're playing. Unlike in Funger Wunger, where you're going to play Enki, and if you're doing the intro and you change one piece of dialogue, congratulations, you no longer have necromancy, and instead you can speak to bugs, which is, it's just not useful. Okay, cool, you could talk to the termite mound, but you're not gonna make it that far anyway. But I digress. Hopping into the game. Like Fear and Hunger 1, you can go through the intro to gain more skills, but I find they are super fleshed out in this one. The intros to each individual character gives you a good idea as to how your choices are going to impact this character's lives a lot, especially from the perspective of Osa. And because of that, you kind of develop more of a connection with these individual characters. So with Marco's story, it covers such a very interesting and deep narrative. This narrative covers him trying to raise money for his sister and him to have a normal life, them getting involved in mafia garbage, and it ended up ruining their lives, so he's trying to run away with what he has left. So picking certain options will give you a different way to see Marco. So if you want to break this game, if you want to make it super easy in the early game, you gotta make sure you end up with 3 specific abilities, and one of them you automatically get, and that is Adrenaline Rush, which if you have it, and you choose in his backstory to be an aggressive boxer, his attacks hit harder the longer in combat he is. Then Lockpicking, which you get if you choose to be a burglar early in his life. That allows you to open most non-special doors. And then you get Quick Jab. Quick Jab is the one you automatically get just by playing Marco, which makes it so that if he isn't equipped with any weapon and he hits with his bare hands, he hits twice instead of once, which might not seem significant, but his fists are stronger than a high-impact rail cannon. So you get all that done, you go through the intro, you find the janitor, hi janitor, and like how I described before, he is a tough encounter. Unless you're playing Marco and then you just beat his ass into the ground. It's kind of funny how I've never lost to this dork while playing Marco. I literally just bully him and take his lunch money afterwards. Because again, Marco punches with the strength of a collapsing star. And if you beat him and search his body after, you get a cool weapon that you can use on other people because Marco is already packing with his own hardware. You leave the dream, meet Prehevil, hi Prehevil, who is genuinely charming, and after that, you go to the spot where we left out on before in the intro of this video. The intro to this game is super efficient. It lets you lose in the first combat encounter, but not instantly, so you can learn some of the mechanics that you didn't know before. Like, I didn't even mention the rev up mechanic, which is new for this game that wasn't in the first. Rev up basically means that every turn that you survive, you can rev up to a maximum of 3 times. And if you rev up once, it increases attack damage. Rev up twice, it increases attack damage further. But if you rev up 3 times, it increases attack damage, but also allows you to attack a second time, which with Marco is actually 4 times because he punches 2 times for every attack. Now you get why Marco is a JoJo character in a horror game. It's pretty radical, but I digress. It also teaches you some of the more main mechanics of the game. Dialogue options, the basic combat, like I mentioned, limb dismemberment, especially if you lose against the janitor, shows you that even if you lose both your legs, you can still continue the game. Once you get out of the dream, you learn that you can also sprint now, which immediately makes every character have the main reason you play Kahara for the early game of Fear and Hunger 1, as you can outrun most enemies in the game, but your stamina bar, though lengthy, is limited, and the recharge rate is incredibly slow, so when you run out of stamina, it can be tense. So where do we go from here now that we are outside of the train and I've given you my rundown of how I see the game every time I start it? So my experience with Termina from here is more or less the same. I did this mostly on my first or second try of the game, and this has been the pattern that I've used ever since, as I find it's my favorite route. Nothing is more difficult in this game than going around alone and then finding an encounter that instantly kills you because you're just one person, so the route that I chose gets you a partner, or a second player character, as soon as possible, which is nice. But I'm going to go through this like I did the first time I played this, so I can give you an idea of how I felt. difficult. So for one, to start this off, you go west. As the train disperses, you see everyone going in separate directions, though you do get a fun Easter egg if you go back into the train with Marco and talk to this goon. But aside from that, follow the handsome Japanese businessman to the west. I followed this path, stealing every piece of colored grass I could find like a demented cow, and eventually found this. Well, that sucks. Hey Tanaka, how you doing? Not good? Cool. Probably gonna get worse for you if I'm being completely honest. So I keep going west until the path takes a turn north, and I end up at a interesting spot where, oh, hello, nightmare creature I don't want to talk about. And I swiftly run away from this man whom I can't show the encounter of because it is too graphic for YouTube or any church. Now, everything in the game from this point is actually directing you to go right, as the man comes off screen from the left, implying that there's danger if you go that way, and he is a very dangerous individual. But if you go left, saying hi to Black Phillip on the way out, you then kind of find a small path to the south hidden, which leads you to bad memories. These things come out of nowhere, and I despise them with a passion. Now, if you played the first game, you'll remember these dickheads and be absolutely afraid for your life. But fortunately, these guys aren't too bad, actually. But also, we are playing Marco, so, well, one of them bites us, and we punch a basketball-sized hole in his chest. The other one thought it would be a cool idea to follow up, and thus I do the same to that thing. Lord knows the hocus-pocus bullshit of this village is not ready for 250 pounds of solid beef and repressed traumatic anger. But I follow the path and find this truck. It's an old Bremen military truck that seems both out of place but not at the same time. And next to it is a fenced off hatch to a small bunker. I walk over and suddenly get greeted by God's finest sidearm, the fully automatic pipe wrench throwing Abella, who is just kind of chill to see you here. So she asks if you want to explore the interior that the hatch leads to together, and well, in you go. How could you say no to that? Inside is a complex network of tunnels that is crawling with random supplies you can grab pretty much without any hassle. Walking around, picking up some gas canisters, trading workout secrets with Abella to just pass some time, while they're wandering. Oh shit, a hat. Neat. Hey, that looks like Tanaka's hat. I hope he's... So, leaving the bunker, I tend to go back the way I came relatively quickly. I mean, we got everything we needed in the bunker, right? Tanaka was probably fine anyhow, he just lost his hat. I make my way back to the train, and from there I see that most of everyone, aside from Marina and Olivia, have gone into the town to look for ways to help us out of this situation. Abella elects momentarily to rest a while at the train, which is nice, and I wish I could join her, but unfortunately, I need to go. So I grab her and we head off to investigate the rest of the village and see where everyone else went. So I decided to go the opposite direction because I won't see Art the Clown again, which didn't happen. I didn't see him, and Tanaka is currently okay. But regardless, a change of pace is probably nice. Wandering through the forest, I found it as you'd expect. It's a forest, filled with trees and shit, and that's where I made it eventually to a stream, and made my way further with no trouble to a beach, which was relatively nice, but this is where it begins to set in tone-wise that there is something wrong with the town of Prehevil. So I'm gonna pop the brakes here just to kind of talk for a second about how this is, I find, a better intro to the game than that of Fear and Hunger 1. See, with Fear and Hunger 1, you make an instant mistake and die, and then you have to really try hard again to not make that mistake. You go up forward, find a giant, and die horribly. Or, well, they're called the guards, but let's not be pedantic here. I find that the slow burn to fight enemies that either can't kill you unless you fight him, or are very hard-pressed to kill you is a lot better than just being blindsided by either the easiest enemies in the game or enemies that will kill you if you do not know what you are doing in the first turn. So, you continue into Prehevil well, and you discover deformed humans roam around the village. This slum-like area is odd. The ones I encounter here are not like in Fear and Hunger 1, where immediately I would be attacked by these entities. I am not. There is some so lost to whatever affliction they have that they do run at me with some kind of aggression. But remember, Marco blasting on all cylinders here. I sent that man's on the lightless walk like my name was Bob Sapp. This area feels like, as I mentioned, a slum. It feels like some place I really shouldn't be. It honestly reminds me of all those historical recollections of leper colonies I've heard about, where people just hide out from the rest of the world here to die. But that's when you meet up with Karen. Hi, Karen. How are yeah, I know it's weird. People are violent. I mean, yeah. Okay, well, regardless, good luck getting mauled to death by something. Bye. I enter this house and am immediately greeted by a lovely family, and oh my god, he has a gun. Oh, that would be scary if I wasn't playing Marco, and he's dead. Yeah, playing through this game with Marco is like playing an RPG based on Ricky-O. I just punch dudes and they explode. It's pretty fun. Oh, your buddy had a piece on him. You think you stand a chance with that? I popped a guy in the jaw so hard earlier, I saw a skeleton explode out the back of his body. You think you can handle this? Bella, you seeing this shit? Regardless, I leave this small house after murdering its inhabitants and enter the village proper, which is when I find myself in the middle of a village that is obviously inspired by Resident Evil 4, with a bunch of shitty mutant villagers running around and doing they thing, and they thing is mostly just attempting to murder me violently, though because I have killing intent, a lot of them are too afraid to even try. This village is actually kinda expansive, way more than it should be. Well, more than you'd expect for what is essentially equating to the early prologue section of the game. The main part of the game opens up once you get into the city, but this is not even part of the city. The enemies here are not too dangerous, though they can cause some status effects like bleed and poison if you're not too careful. There is also that one pig guy with the mask. You don't want to run into him, we'll admit. Pretty hard fight, especially for early in the game. I wander around the village more and more, picking up supplies, beating the souls out of individual villagers who just so had the misfortune of walking into me, and eventually find a cute little building, which I swiftly unlock the door to and enter, finding upstairs to the left and to the right a rifle. Because I'm cute like that, and it wouldn't be a Resident Evil reference without a rifle upstairs. So I take that, chamber the round. Oh, feels nice. You leave the house, and that is when you see the manor, a massive building constructed of different materials in comparison to the rest of the village. It's imposing, and honestly, it tells you everything you need to know, that this is obviously something you should interact with just by how different it is. See, earlier in the game, there's a gated area that you can't get through that has a very similar construction to the area prior to this manor. So it shows that in order to progress through one, you might have to progress to the other. Its intimidating visage made me a bit reluctant my first time through, but regardless of my reluctance, I entered the manor. Inside, I find myself with an intensely eerie silence. The only thing you hear is the soft sound of your footsteps and the doors opening as you look around the manor. This is obviously the largest building you have encountered at this point in the game. Now that I find interesting, as by implication, this sequel to a game all about never leaving a dungeon has never once made you feel like you need to stay inside. Now, there is the ability to take a shortcut back in that tunnel where Tanaka was having his picnic, but that is only a shortcut to another open area. This game is a lot more open than the first game, and I really like the agoraphobic feeling that comes from traversing the towns. And it sets the precedent that when you enter buildings, it becomes even more claustrophobic than it would have been in the entirety of the first game, which is a very good thing. Since I took lockpicking with Marco, I skip a few steps and unlock the doors on the ground floor before heading upstairs to do some more exploring. So far, the manor has been a bit closed off with no major threats, but that's when I see this thing. Okay, I'm not a genius, not even close, if I'm being 100 with you, but I can tell the second I walk within 5 feet of this man, I'm going to... And there you go, that's... Yep. Oh god, you are ugly. Oh shit, he's a caster too. That's not good. Well, anyway, Bella, throw a wrench at his head. And you thought I was gonna punch him this time. Nah, sometimes you gotta beat things over the head with a pipe wrench. It just works out, right? So with the Dark Priest dead, I found myself thinking that this place was probably safe. So in Fear and Hunger 1 and in this game, you save your game by going to sleep. But the trade-off is if the area is unsafe, you will have to do a coin flip. Fail that, you immediately have to make a combat encounter. I'm gonna spoil something here that if you kill the Dark Priest in this area, you don't have to worry about that coin flip and this is just a safe place you can sleep. But when you go to sleep in this game, unlike in the other game, some other things happen as well. But I won't bother you by telling you what. You're going to have to play the game itself to find out. Regardless, we wake up and wander around the manor, and that's when you find him. A hulking brute of a monster reminiscent of the Lords of Flies from the first game's endgame content, which immediately tells you not to fuck around with this thing. The thing that unnerves me most about it is that it doesn't attack you. It doesn't remain motionless and just stare at you. And even worse, it doesn't even threaten you not to come in. It talks to you and asks you to share dinner with it. Which, considering you are now in his house, you have to say yes. It'd be rude otherwise. He tries to treat you to a wonderful meal, several courses, but the trick here is he will ask you what you think of them. If you answer politely, nothing will happen to you. But if you are rude or crass in any way, he will not hesitate to rip your head off. And also, he is an incredibly strong enemy, even for, mid to late game. The Gentleman is a creature that is singular in its existence. Well, sort of. We will get there, but before I do, you finish your meal and he asks you one last question. Do you support the Bremen army? Me being me, I said no, they suck. I went into one of their bunkers on one playthrough and saw the scariest shit I've ever seen, so no. And I'm not talking about needles. He agrees and gives you a key. One of two keys. You need to accomplish something rather interesting. And he sends you on your way. That's it. He will not fight you. Unless you attack him, and then, oh boy, you better be careful. He swings. But this is when I have to point out something to you all. Now, for people who've played this game, this will not be news to you at all. But for all of you who haven't played this game, and I'm kind of your first step into it, which probably uncommon considering how much this game gets covered, but I digress. What if I told you that this individual is a character you've already seen before? What if I told you this character was on the train with you and was one of the people waiting outside for you when you originally left, and was one of the 14 that were made to be participants in the Festival of Termina last minute? Yes, I referenced this earlier, but this thing, the Gentleman, the mayor, is Henrik, the chef, which now brings me to one of, if not the most interesting parts of this game, where we will draw a close to this introduction as well as analysis of Termina in comparison to Fear and Hunger, and that is, what is moon scorching? And why does it immediately elevate this game conceptually above the first game by massive leagues, in my opinion? In order to understand moon scorching, we have to understand something I have been kind of neglecting to discuss. What is Termina? The Festival of Termina, that is. To get into that, you see people tend to discuss it from two different angles. A very simplified version, or a bit of a more complicated one. I tend towards more of the complicated way of looking at it, but the more simplified version of looking at it is that it is simply a death game, similar to a battle royale, or what have you, where you have to fight and die or else. But I think it's more complicated than that. Now, in my playthroughs, I've noticed that it is a bit vague as to what the designed intent of the Festival of Termina is, but let me discuss what I think. So, in short, the festival is being hosted by Prehevil, the envoy to the moon god Rare. Rare is a trickster old god, and wasn't really mentioned in the first game. Rare did have some representatives in that game in the form of Pocket Cat, but the thing to know about Rare is that it has many preconceived notions about humanity that will not be shaken. It believes that humanity is scum. They are detestable. They are rather gross individuals, and when cast into a bright light, humanity's first instinct is to fight and throw others down from high perches to better their own station. The Festival of Termina, in my opinion, isn't so much a battle royale as it is a means for Rare to prove its point by subjecting every individual in Prehevil to succumb to their darkest desires or succumb to the desires of others. It's why at the end of the game you can still survive with every person intact in the party. I mean, it is possible. I think maybe only if you play a Bella, but it is possible. But the fun part is that Prehevil, the envoy to the moon, states that you don't actually have to participate. As in, there is nothing fully stopping you physically from just not harming your fellow man. But Rare is a trickster god. So this is true. But if you neglect to do so, and you yourself are incredibly resolved to not harm anyone else, like Rare wants to prove all humanity will, you will attract its gaze. The gaze of the moon is much like being under a magnifying glass on a summer day. You become burned by the gaze of this eldritch god, which is moon scorching, which is a process that isn't 100% identified, as it's pretty abstract. It can take days, it can take minutes, but in easiest terms, if you do not participate in the events of the festival, you will be transformed into something that will participate, but it is still also you to some degree. To break that down a little further, there are two categories that you become when you become moon scorched that I sum up as either Silent Hill monster or possession by another entity. So what do I mean by Silent Hill monster? Well, with the majority of the cast, when they refuse to fight, at a certain point they will become a monster that is an abstract reimagining of them as a person. This form, from what we can tell, at base is the same person, but with the worst traits they have or that they perceive themselves to have being amplified to a point where they are a creature based around the entire negative aspects of their personality. For example, let's see Marco, the giant. See, Marco has always struggled with his lot in life. In his childhood area, he was surrounded by organized crime, murder, and even worse. He wanted to live a good life for him and his sister and provide for the two of them, but the one and only thing that he was good at was practical applications of intense violence. So what ended up happening? He ended up getting into boxing. It actually made a lot of money, and to make something of his life, it seemed like the right direction to go. But it only ended up with him getting embroiled in some crime family that made him kill someone. It ended with him, depending on your choices, killing another individual and then fleeing the city that he was born in. He is a person who worries that all he will ever be is a man capable of violence and nothing else. So when you see his moon-scorched form, there's kind of a Greek tragedy aspect to it. The giant. You can see where a lot of the design elements come from, his arms twisting into nothing more than meaty clubs that can only harm things, but also resembling the stitched up leather of boxing gloves. His body is twisted into a giant mass of scarred tissue, teeth, and eyes, his face completely losing its individuality. It's actually a common trend for that of all moon-scorched to have the first thing or the worst thing that gets changed on them to be their face. The only exception would probably be Marina, but even then, if you trace the anatomy of the design, you can see that this head that is coming up between these legs is not actually her real face, and the cocoon that this design gets its name from is actually sprouting from where her head was. So you could determine that her original face was actually destroyed by the moon scorching like everything else. Wait, can I even show this? This is very... Okay, this is... You know what? If I get dinged by this and my channel gets attacked by YouTube for anything, it will probably be me showing this, because whatever, but it serves a point, and if I die for the bit, I'll die for the bit. But that is the easiest way to interpret it, but I personally see it a little differently. So, as we know, the majority of the individuals that are hit with moon scorching become the worst version of themselves. But what if this version was dictated by Rare's perception of this individual rather than their perception of themselves? I think it would make sense, as Rare has a rather disdainful idea of what humanity is. What if instead of just turning them into their worst selves, Rare can look into their soul, see every thought they have, and instead of their change being dictated by their own self-perceptions, it's actually Rare turning them into a form of how it perceives them and their insecurities. Which explains why Caligura, who, no, I am not showing his monster form, it looks, rough, is a monster with self-confidence issues when he has been shown to be nothing but a confident murderer of a man. Same with someone like Abella, where she is not shown to have any issues with her presentation of femininity or masculinity, but for some reason, her moon-scorched form is a hulking brute that has predominantly masculine traits and a trunk, of course. So, I think Rare, when it moon-scorches someone with its baleful gaze, it transforms them into how it believes they actually look if all of their insecurities were unveiled to the world itself, thinking that the darker side of a person's personality should be shown at all times. This culmination of their negative side is actually the true form of humanity, and thus it exemplifies the traits that are related to it. You know, the light hides what is hidden, and thus with nothing left to hide, this is the truest form of humanity, right? It definitely reeks of an alien thought process as to how humanity works and how basic morality works. There is also the two individuals who are not so much transformed as possessed, though Henrik is a bit up in the air. There is a few dialogue entries that I noticed about how people are uncomfortable being around the mayor, like he has always been a character, but regardless, I lump these two together. I might cover the possession ideas a little bit more in a different video, but for now, you're probably asking, why is all of this significant? Because it reeks of cosmic horror on a level that Fear and Hunger 1 never truly achieved for me. Sure, with the first game, you had this cosmic nihilism of the new gods, and them realizing they are not even going to be a fraction as powerful as the old gods, and eventually they will be forgotten, as well as entering the void and so on. But I find the agoraphobia of being constantly watched over your head by some massive moon that if you displease it during its festival, it will transform you into an abomination that forces you to live out what you want to keep hidden and what you see as like the worst traits in your life forever. And there is no time limit, by the way. The reason I chose to highlight Henrik as the first moon-scorched victim is he can become moon-scorched in as early as the afternoon of day 1, which I think is terrifying, as you never know when you are gonna pop. Now, as the PC of the game, you probably are safe until the last part of the game, but for every other character, it's kind of up in the air. If you look at the guide for who turns moon-scorched at what time, it's got a pretty even distribution throughout the various days and times. The Festival of Termina is a dance of insanity where you will participate, or else be changed in your mentality or be changed in your entirety of being. And honestly, I think this makes it so much more horrifying than the first game, as the horrible god bullshit that you have to deal with is up front and center from the second you find out about it, and you know about it from every other playthrough afterwards. Now, type of horror that I find most terrifying is loss of agency. This loss of ability to control yourself and be able to dictate your own choices is one of the reasons why I gravitate towards things like this, because it's genuinely something that terrifies me. So the idea of becoming your worst self and having to hyperfixate on all of your insecurities because someone saw that as like your most predominant trait is genuinely some of the best and scariest horror I've ever seen. And don't even get me started on the sulfur cultists of this game. This game executes the gameplay of the first game with more polish and better mechanics. It executes the concepts of the first game with more nuance and a better understanding of horror as well as existentialism, but alongside that, the concepts themselves are expanded upon and given more depth without being bloated. It executes a story that just is flat out better than the first Fear and Hunger because you actually get a story. You can put things together outside of a single text crawl at the beginning and sometimes times talking to one scared individual hiding in a prison cell somewhere. And in general, Fear and Hunger Termina is just the better game of the two. Now, say what you want about personal preference, but it feels like Miro, the individual who worked on this game, actually learned from their experience working on the first game and used all this knowledge to make this masterpiece. Termina is probably one of my favorite games of all time, and I'm genuinely excited to see where Miro goes next with this series. Be it adding the ability to play the other contestants of the 14, or just making a new game. I will support it as long as it has the same level of polish, which I doubt they're going to regress on. And the best part of this game is I have only covered the first day of content of 3 in Termina. So if anything I've said intrigues you, please, for the love of all that is holy, go play this game. It is significantly more approachable than Fear and Hunger 1, and also has an easy mode so that you can actually play the game and not have to worry about dying every 30 seconds to something. I want to thank that dear friend of mine that I mentioned in the first video for Fear and Hunger 1 for introducing me to this game series. And I mentioned to them that I made the first video and that I'm going to be making this video, and asked them to give some of their words about the game so we can kind of hear their thought process of it. So here's what they said.
Go fuck yourself.
Okay, cool. Guess that wraps up this. And thank you to everyone who watched this long-ass video. This is probably the longest video I've ever made. I'm kinda new to the horror video game essay shtick, so I hope it was at least entertaining. Let me know in the comments other games you'd like to see me cover, and if you especially liked the video, feel free to like and subscribe, as it helps me know that you guys like this style of content. I hope you all have a wonderful night. Until next time.